to introduce then Trevor DeVries. Trevor from Guelph University, someone that is another person that I've followed over the years, I guess, and referenced, and it's lovely to have him here. He's also somebody that has been in some of the sessions already this afternoon, and I'm pleased that we've got now the chance of his company for the next hour. So Trevor, you're extremely welcome. And I'd ask you, please, as I move all the paper around, in terms of cow behavior, that's what we're going to cover for the next hour. And cow behavior to identify cow health problems in dairy cows. Trevor, you're very welcome to the UK, and thank you for your time in the next 3 days. So it's over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. As just introduced, I had a pleasure of giving a workshop earlier already this afternoon, and we had a very good, smaller audience than this, but a very good audience, very interactive. This is going to be a little less of an interactive presentation, but if there's something burning as I go along, you can ask, but probably best to keep most stuff to the end. We'll hopefully end on time. We have an hour, right? Yeah, perfect. So my background primarily, actually my training in dairy cattle is primarily in the behavior of cows and understanding why cows behave the way they do. And explaining that to a producer group or to people working in the industry usually goes over pretty well, but when you explain that to someone sitting next to you on an airplane or something like that, and that I study the behavior of cows, you get this kind of this blank stare, right? And but from my perspective, I'm very passionate about it, and the workshop I gave this morning was really kind of the primary area which I work in, is really using behavior as a tool to understand or to identify how we can improve feeding and feeding management and housing management of cows. And another area that I've been spending a lot of time in recently, and we're building up a lot of data, and I have a number of colleagues working in, is this area of using behavior of dairy cows to not only identify but predict problems in dairy cows and health-related issues that we have. And this idea of using behavior to detect disease is not really a new idea, and this is something that we do on a daily basis in terms of looking at our cows. And we've long known that monitoring behavior over time can have good utility in identifying these cows and predicting illness. And part of the reason for that, or particularly in terms of identifying cows, we know that when cows get sick, cows express sickness behavior just like us. If we get sick, we don't feel well, we change the way we behave, and largely that's a good thing. We often do that as a way to help ourselves recover, or hopefully we do. And in cases where we don't, we often, or we tend to sometimes get worse off in those circumstances. And so it's a very natural thing for cows to do this as well. As a prey animal, they will hide a bit of that behavior to some degree, but in general, when cows are sick, they will demonstrate, some change in their behavior, often related to their feeding behavior, drinking behavior, or just general activity patterns in relation to the malaise that they might be feeling under those circumstances. At the same time, we also know that some behavioral patterns may be predictive of illness, and so the expression of that behavior might be able to tell us whether or not they might succumb to something or be at a higher risk of gaining some kind of ill health problem. And so where we can use that really is then we can often identify environmental factors, whether it be housing, its management, or nutrition, that might be related to the expression of those behaviors. And then we can take that knowledge and do something about it and make some changes. And so kind of as an initial take home on this, and what I want people to think about as I walk through some examples this afternoon, is that first off, we can use behavior to identify something wrong in the animal. And then if we can do that, then we can take that information, identify the need for treatment or for just maybe assessment of that animal, further assessment. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here. And at the same time, there might be cases where we want to indicate a problem, or it might be indicating a problem in the environment. If we see the expression of a behavior, it might indicate something wrong or something amiss in the environment of the animal, and then we can take a closer look at that environment and use that information to identify the need to make changes in response to that. And so what I'm going to do this afternoon is walk through a number of examples, and it's not an exhaustive list, but just keying in on a few, I guess, key behaviors, particularly related to feeding, so rumination behavior, eating behavior of cows, and then the standing lying behavior patterns of cows. Still there? Good. And relate this to a variety of conditions that we face on a regular basis in our dairy herds. And what I'm going to hopefully do is also introduce the need for some automation and in the detection of these different behaviors as well. And again, I won't have all the answers, and I'm not going to cover everything that's out there and everything that we can do, but just give you some kind of food for thought as we go along here. And so the first example I want to talk about is rumination behavior. And when we think about rumination behavior, this is really the behavior that keeps the cow going, particularly from a metabolic standpoint. Rumination is basically what defines a ruminant, what defines the dairy cow in terms of how she processes her feed. And she needs that behavior. She needs to express that rumination behavior to keep her rumen healthy, so to break down feed, to produce saliva, keep the system going, buffer her system, and keep the fermentation pattern and everything stable and going. And so with that in mind, it becomes very evident and clear that any changes in the rumination behavior should be indicative of something problematic in those cows. Okay. Sorry about that. Is it on? Is it on? No. Yeah? No. Is it on now? I might lose my voice by the end. Anyway, so rumination being really critical for the cow is obviously going to have an impact if we see changes in that behavior. And so there's a host of things that we can detect changes or think about changes in rumination behavior in dairy. It would be related to changes in acidosis. No, there we go. How's that? There's still a bit of gain there. What's that? The handheld? How's that? I might have a hard time. This is an exercise in human behavior. How's that? Can I hold it there? I'm going to have to keep my hand pretty rigid here, I think. So it's going to move up and down and around, and hopefully it can pick me up. So anyways, so when we think of rumen function, we think particularly of fluctuations in rumen pH. The one thing that comes to mind is subacute ruminal acidosis. And this is something that I think we know that the dairy industry worldwide battles with to a large extent. And what happens during subacute ruminal acidosis, and this is just an example here where it may not seem that obvious, but when pH fluctuates, in particular as it drops down into ranges, and I put here a threshold of a pH of 6. Some people might say that's 5.8, but anytime you get these dips in pH, particularly below that pH threshold of around 6, we get a disruption in normal rumen function. And in particular, we have a disruption in the bacteria that do a good job of digesting the fiber in the rumen. And when that happens, we get inefficiencies in terms of the digestion. Things might slow down. we get the increased risk, particularly if those drops are even larger, increased risk of butterfat depression, and kind of a cascading effect. One of the problems, though, that we have is that we have this inability to really do a good job of clinically identifying particularly individual cows, but even at a herd level, we have some markers for acidosis, but we have a real difficult time actually identifying cows with subacute ruminal acidosis. Try one more. Okay. We're going? Good? Okay. Enough of that. So one of the issues, as I was just mentioning, it's difficult to diagnose, and I put a list up of things here that we could use to identify acidosis. So fluctuating feed intake, reduced feed digestibility, low milk fat, loose manure, laminitis. Useful, but sometimes difficult to identify, particularly for individual cows in a group environment. But on the other side as well, is that these outcomes are often related to a whole host of other things that cows might be facing on our farms as well. So not very specific to acidosis itself in all cases. And so this is where rumination behavior comes in. There we go. And over the years, and I heard this years ago already, and many of you have probably heard this before, is that we have the potential then of looking at rumination behavior, particularly at a herd level, and maybe gaining some inference about what might be going on in the cows, particularly the rumen health of the cows, based on, say, even counting the number of cows that are ruminating at a given time or something like that. And there's some numbers out there, and one of the numbers that was thrown out to me a number of years ago, and I've seen in a few articles, is that you can walk into your barn at any given time, and if the cows are lying down and chewing their cud, you should have at least 40% of your cows ruminating at a given time. And that should indicate that things are pretty good. Or I've heard numbers of 60% and that being pretty good. And so we actually took an approach to try evaluate that a few years ago. And so we did a challenge study where we actually challenged cows with subacute ruminal acidosis. And what you see here in the graph is cows on the top. These are healthy cows, so pre-acidosis. And what you see is their rumination behavior, defined by the percentage of cows ruminating every 15 minutes, averaged over a 24-hour period, averaged over a number of cows. And what you have here is different time points in the day, so period 1 in the middle of the day, and then 2 and 3 in the late night and early morning hours. And these are periods of time when we expect cows to be ruminating. So away from milking time, away from feeding time, that's when we expect cows to be ruminating. And what we see, quite interesting, when we took the mean, is that we saw about 40% of cows ruminating across the day during those time periods. So that is a pretty good estimate, that 40%, as we've heard before. So when we induced acidosis in these cows, what we saw, which was quite interesting, is that we saw about an 8–9% drop in terms of the number of cows that were ruminating across the day. And that's what you have here on the bottom graph here, is the percentage of cows that were ruminating during this period of acidosis. So we see this 8–9% drop across the day. So maybe there is some value in looking at the number of cows that are ruminating across the day. But does anyone see a problem with just walking in the barn and counting the number of cows? What do you see? You see it going like this, right? So you could walk in the barn and you could come here when there's no cows ruminating, or you can come half an hour later and there's a whole bunch of cows ruminating. So we actually did a number analysis on this, and we determined that you'd have to walk into the barn 40 times, count the number of cows, average that, and that would give you an accurate estimate of the mean number of cows ruminating during that time period. And so that's completely impractical. So the value of a one-time walkthrough, we're really not quite sure what that means. Maybe in this scenario, if all the cows are healthy, yes, but to actually detect a problem, maybe not so much. So this is where automation comes into the conversation here, and I just want to throw this out as one example here. And there are tools now available to automatically record certain behaviors, and the one quite well-validated rumination one is this SCR tag, the HR tag. It's sold with the Lely robots. You can also buy a standalone system. There's other systems out there available. There's a couple other commercial systems, at least, that I know of that are available. And they seem to do a pretty good job. And particularly this one's been well validated, it's been published in scientific journals, et cetera, a number of times. And so what this allows you to do then is accurately capture it on a herd basis, on an individual cow basis, so we can look at those, we can look at herd level changes, we can look at cow level changes, and we can look for changes in that behavior without having to go in and actually count the number of cows. What's interesting about this tool here, and particularly this device here or devices like this, is then we can apply it to other scenarios as well. And so we have some data from a mastitis challenge trial that we conducted a few years ago, where we induced cows with an endotoxin to simulate a clinical case of a toxic mastitis. And what you see here is the change in rumination in association with that cow experiencing that clinical mastitis. So here in the open circles, you see the rumination of that cow drop, and this is post-injection of the endotoxin, and then creep up again later on, whereas the cows that were given a placebo in this case stayed pretty flatlined. So it's not only the total amount of time or total number of cows, but we could look within the day, we can see changes, look for changes from baseline, and see changes in the behavior of the cow, indicated this case of a clinical case of mastitis. And it doesn't only have to be within the day. There's other aspects of across the day. This is some really new data from one of my graduate students. We're still collecting this data, so we're about halfway through a trial, but we pulled up some of the data because I thought it fits well with some of the data I'm going to show you a little bit later on. But looking at using rumination behavior to identify cows with subacute or subclinical ketosis. And I don't think this is surprising to people that we see cows with ketosis having lower rumination times, and even a week prior to calving, we see these cows already having lower rumination times, and likely related to dry matter intakes, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But again, a good example of some utility in potentially identifying cows in kind of a non-invasive, at a group level manner. We can pick up these cows a lot earlier than we might have picked up in any previous scenario. One of the challenges that we have, though, and nothing typifies this better than some of the examples here, is that a change in rumination behavior might be indicative of a whole bunch of things. And so in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a host of studies being done, and I pulled out a few, where they've used automatic detection of rumination behavior to try identify a number of different things. So estrus detection, heat stress, markers of postpartum disease, even prediction of calving. You can see that around the period of calving, you see this drop in rumination activity. So the question then becomes, and that's with any of these kind of things, is it's fine to see a change in the behavior of the cow, but what that strictly is doing for us is giving us a cue to actually go take a look at that cow, or if it's a herd level, right, take a broader look at the herd and what's going on here. Because in this case here, if we see a change in rumination, whether it's within a day or between days or within cows, we don't know exactly what the problem is. And I don't think that changes our approach, but it potentially allows us to get to those cows a little bit sooner than we previously have using more visual or approaches to identifying cows. Sorry. This thing's a bit sticky. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk you through is feeding behavior, and it's highly related, I guess, to this topic of rumination. And the first example I want to go through is actually data that was collected by colleagues of mine at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And you might have seen this data before. But this is a study done by Julie Hezzy. She was a master's student while I was a PhD student at UBC. And what Julie did was follow a group of transition dairy cows from about 2 weeks before calving to 3 weeks after calving. And she was interested in their feeding behavior in terms of their feed intake and the amount of time that those cows are spending at the feed bunk. And what was striking is that after Julie collected data on 100 plus cows, she went back and then separated the cows as being either healthy or succumbing to some kind of postpartum illness. And in particular, what I'm going to show you is the cows that develop mastitis or uterine infection. But when she pulled out the cows that were healthy and looked at their feeding, in this case, their dry matter intake, she saw a stark kind of difference in that dry matter intake pattern over that transition period than what we've typically seen before. So what do you see here that's different than what you'd expect? What have you always been told? What happens in the last week of calving? they drop, right? So we've always been told last week before calving, even 2 weeks before calving, you're going to see this drop in dry matter intake. In this case, when we single out those cows that remained healthy, had no issues in the first 3 or 4 weeks of lactation, we don't see that drop in dry matter intake. We see them carry on pretty steady. In this case, when we add in the cows that develop mild metritis, and this is diagnosed based on a temperature and a discharge, we see this drop in dry matter intake occurring. And of course, not too surprising, and this is related to that sickness behavior, once the cow has the clinical symptoms of behavior, you expect to see that difference in their dry matter intake, in how well those cows are performing. And this is particularly evident with cows that were developing a severe metritis. These are cows that had a febrile response or feverish, and also had a putrid vaginal discharge. And these cows, again, much lower dry matter intake here, but already 2-3 weeks prior to that, these cows are showing a drop in their dry matter intake. In this case, we don't know what's causing that drop, but what's really interesting here is that this pattern of dry matter intake correlated very well with their feeding time as well. And you might say, well, that's expected, right? So the more time that the cows spend at the feed bunk, the more their intake is. And that's what we typically expect, that we'd see a very similar pattern. But what this allows us to do is then, hey, look at that and think, well, what can we measure on that cow? Can we actually measure the amount that she consumes? I'll come back to that in a minute. But we might be able to get back to measuring how much time that cow's at the bunk and be able to identify those cows potentially a little bit earlier, or see what might be different between those cows and other cows in the herd. And why this is of interest is that, and I don't want to go through the numbers too closely with you, but what we see here is correlations between feeding time and dry matter intake. And like I said before, we expect them to be correlated, but in this case, particularly for the sick cows post-calving, but even pre-calving as well, there was a strong relationship between their feeding time and their dry matter intake, or much stronger than what we've typically seen in a lot of other studies. And what this tells us is that even if we don't know cause and effect, we do know that if we can stimulate those cows to spend more time at the bunk, we could potentially also get those cows to eat more. And where this becomes clear in terms of kind of looking at opportunities, when we look at these cows in terms of when they were distributing their feeding time, we actually see that these cows that were succumbing to illness, particularly post-calving, these cows were spending less time at the feed bunk at these peak feeding periods of the day. So the times when we expect cows to get to the bunk, that's when those biggest differences in their feeding activity and their total dry matter intake was occurring. So then we have to start thinking of what's holding these cows back. So what's restricting the cows from accessing the bunks at those times? Is it related to housing? Is it space allowance? Is it stocking density? All those kind of things that we can start thinking about what's holding those cows back, and what opportunities can we get to stimulate those cows? Can we provide feed more often, or whatever it is, get those cows up and get them to the bunk more often? One other example related to this, and this relates to the example of the data I showed you earlier on rumination behavior in relation to ketosis. This same relationship has also been shown with feeding activity. In this case, another student from the University of British Columbia in Canada looking at ketosis, subclinical ketosis in relation to feeding activity, and she saw the same relationship with dry matter intake, but I just thought this was interesting. This is actually the amount of visits to the feeder, and these numbers look kind of funny. You think 40 visits to the feeder, but that's the number of times per day that the cow stuck her head in and out of the feed rail per day. And so this difference in the amount of time that these cows were basically active at the feed bunk. So it's showing how active these cows were at the feed bunk, how much time they were in and out of that feed bunk of the day was indicative of potentially a risk for ketosis. And again, probably related, or was related to dry matter intake, which was probably the risk factor for the ketosis itself, but a good example of the fact that we can potentially then use this behavior to identify these cows earlier. So that asks the question then, can we tell if a cow's eating or not? Can you? If you've got 500 cows in a group, how are you going to tell if one cow's feeding or not? It's pretty difficult, right? And so we have a very hard time tracking a dry matter intake in a group, but again, this is one of these areas where there is some opportunity here from an automation standpoint. And I just pulled up one example. Some of you might have seen this. It's I think it's the Eng's Track-A-Cow system, where they have a cable antenna by the feed bunk, and the cow wears a transponder, and you can actually pick up, based on the antenna sending a signal out, it can pick up how often that cow's at the bunk, how many minutes per day the cow's at the bunk. So yeah, we can't track dry matter intake, but we can tell if that cow's there. And given our knowledge of kind of some of these relationships, we should be able to tell, or at least identify if we see a deviation in kind of the normal from that cow or from the herd normal, to take a closer look at that cow and see maybe there's something wrong with that cow that we need to focus on. So what else can we do with that knowledge? Well, I guess I already kind of said this, but allow the cows to access the bunk. And if we see problems like this, this ties into my other presentation, so if you're there this afternoon already for my presentation, I went into more detail, and if you're there tomorrow, you'll hear this then. But it's really allowing cows to access the bunk when they want to, and these are the things that are going to restrict cows from getting to the bunk. So making sure there's fresh feed, they're pushing up feed often, having enough bunk space, and I put there, this is especially true for these transition dairy cows that are going to be the most vulnerable to succumbing to these things. The next thing I want to do is talk about predicting and identifying the risk of illness in relation to standing and lying behavior. And I think most of us understand the need for dairy cows to lie down and the importance of that behavior, and particularly it's the time period of the day when the cow rests, it's the time period when she spends most time ruminating, and so we view it as a highly important behavior from a metabolic standpoint, from a milk production standpoint. But it's not only the total amount of time the cow spends lying down, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but it's also when and where a cow stands and lies down that's going to be important from a health perspective. And I think the most clear example of that is in relation to udder health and mastitis. And so we know that the environment is a potential risk factor for mastitis in dairy cows. And so in particular relation to environmental bacteria. So when and where a cow stands and lies down in that environment, and particularly what that environment looks like, is going to have a huge impact on that cow's risk for udder infection. Now thankfully, and sorry this picture is a little small, but thankfully most of our cows don't live in environments like that, and hopefully they don't. And in that case, that's a pretty clear risk factor, no matter where the cow stands and when the cow lies down or where the cow lies down, that there's going to be an issue there. So it's a bit more precise than that. And the one thing I want to talk about today specifically is a behavior that we've long kind of had some knowledge on, but no real good data to support. And this is this idea, and if you heard me speaking earlier today in the workshop, this idea of cows standing for a period of time after milking. And we've long been advocated by various people that cows need to spend a certain amount of time on their feet after milking. And the theory's always been that the teat canal is open after milking, and over the first kind of half an hour to 2 hours after milking, that teat canal kind of comes to a maximum closure, and it's during that time period we want the cow to lie down, because then she'll be at a lower risk of acquiring bacteria into her udder as she lies down and potentially her udder makes contact with the stall surface. And for that reason, we've often provided fresh feed near the time of milking to provide that stimulus for cows to stay on their feet. Now, when I started looking at this about 6 years ago already, we started looking through the literature, and we found that there was actually no data. There was no data to support that idea. There's been lots of studies on teat closure, or not a lot, but there are some studies, but no control studies, no epidemiological studies to look at whether or not cows are really at a higher risk if they lie down immediately or spend a certain amount of time standing. And so we set out in one study and actually snowballed into a series of studies that we've done over the last 4 years. And so we conducted a series of studies. We first started with some cows that were housed in tie stalls, then we moved to freestall house that were robotically milked or parlor milked 3 times a day, and looked at this relationship between the post-milking standing time and the cow's risk for subclinical mastitis. And quite interestingly, across all these studies, we found the median amount of time that cows spent standing was about an hour to close to an hour and a half, particularly, and I'll come back to that in our 3X milk cows. And this is where we've been told over the years is probably around where cows should be standing, at least probably about an hour after milking time. So that was promising in itself. So in our first study, the results were a little bit more surprising, or a little bit different than what we kind of expected. In particular, what we have here is on average, for all the cows we followed, we have their standing time following milking, so the average amount of time those cows are standing after milking. And then what we have here is an odds ratio, and it's basically a risk ratio. So where 1 is our reference, so anything under 1 would be a lower risk, and everything over 1 would be a higher risk. And to our hypothesis, to what we expected, what we saw was that when cows stood for about 40 to 60 minutes, and sorry, the line's not that clear because it's grouped by time points, but if they stood for about 40 to 60 minutes, they had a really slightly lower risk versus those cows that say lie down, this point here, that lie down within 40 minutes of milking. So they had a little lower risk. So that fit well with our theory. But what was unique and totally novel and still quite unexplained is that at the same time, we had cows that were spending, an hour and a half, 2 hours or longer, and it's particularly these cows here that were spending 2-3 hours on their feet after milking that were even at a higher risk of succumbing to some kind of subclinical mastitis. And so we started scratching our heads and thinking, well, why is this? So this is why we actually spurned a series of studies on this. And it was quite interesting that we saw something quite similar when we looked at cows that were milked 3 times a day. Sorry, there we go. So this is the same type of graph, standing time following milking, the odds ratio, scale's a little bit different. But in this case, with these cows that were milked 3 times a day, they were standing a little bit longer. So these cows, rather than standing about 60 minutes, they're standing for about 80 to 90 minutes after milking. And that's the kind of time period where we saw the lowest risk of infection right there, versus cows that lie down sooner, so the higher risk, as well as, again, these cows that are spending a long period of time standing following milking. And so, again, I don't have the answers here, and we could hypothesize about what's going on with these cows, but what this is telling me is there is definitely some possibilities here. We've got enough devices out there, we've got enough automated lying detection devices that we can put on our cows nowadays that if we sync them up to our parlors, we knew when cows were milked, we know when they lie down, and we can get systems to actually tell us what that time difference is. We might be able to identify what's going on in some of these cows. And while I'm concerned about these cows that lie down immediately after milking, I'm probably even more concerned about these cows that are spending 3, 4, 5 hours on their feet after milking and trying to identify why those cows are standing on their feet that long and what we can do about those cows. So greater risk, I just expressed that, greater risk in those cows that lay down immediately, longer for 3X milk cows, and particularly for these cows that are waiting for extended periods of time. Now the question again, and this is one of these behaviors that we know not only what it might be related to, but we also know what we can do to control this behavior as well. So how do we make cows stand longer after milking? Feed them, right? And so this isn't rocket science, but again, we've got the data to suggest we need to ensure cows have that stimulus to stay on their feet after they've been milked. And this is really well exemplified in this data set that I have on the screen here, where we actually looked at cows that were robotically milked. And that in a study on robotic milking, we were kind of hoping to see that we'd see a lot of variability in terms of when cows would stand down after milking, because cows are milking at all different time points in the day. So presumably when they get out of the robotic milker, there might not be fresh feed, or feed would be pushed up. And yeah, we did see quite a bit of variability there. So what we did is we looked at the difference in time between when they were milked and when feed was manipulated. So when either fresh feed was delivered or the feed was pushed up to the cows. And what you see is this nice kind of bell-shaped response here, where you get cows spending the most time on their feet following milking when they milk close in time to a feed push-up. And it makes sense, right? There's fresh feed there particularly, and that's where the data suggests. But even having feed pushed up and making sure that there's feed available to them at all time points across the day is going to do a good job in keeping those cows up on their feet. So ensuring cows have that stimulus, providing fresh feed close to milking time, pushing up frequently, making sure it's there. Sorry. Okay. Next example in terms of lying behavior is detecting lameness. And I don't think I have to say too much in terms of the importance of detecting lameness. We have a variety of sessions this week on lameness, on hoof care, and it's something that's widely recognized as probably one of the biggest issues that we have in the dairy industry today. Not only the early detection, but designing and managing facilities to reduce the amount of lameness. And I think we're well aware of the numbers, but I just wanted to show you some data that came out of North America in the last couple of years. You might have seen this, or you might have seen, but this is group, UBC research group, so former colleagues of mine in British Columbia, working with herds in British Columbia, Canada. The CA is California in the United States, and the NE is the northeast states in the United States, so New York, Pennsylvania, and Vermont, so the northeast corner of the US. And what they did was they went on these farms, 40 farms in each of these areas. These are all freestall farms, and they looked at the amount of lameness in these herds. And this is the percentage of cows that were scored as subclinical or mildly or severely lame, so any kind of gait normality. So these aren't just the three-legged kind of limping cows, but these are also the cows that are hunched up a bit, that are showing a bit of head bob and short tracking their feet, etc. And when we look at the BC and California data, this is kind of where most of our numbers fit quite well in terms of other estimates. So they're around the 30% mark, and that's not that wasn't too surprising. Quite surprising it was this northeast US where they got numbers in the 50s, 55% of cows exhibiting signs of lameness in the study. This is a 5-point scale, yeah. So this is basically a 3 and above, yeah. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, and we could go into a whole conversation about the risk factors, particularly for these northeast herds, what was different about that, and they've been able to tease that out. And if you're interested, you can talk to me later or look up the subsequent studies to that. But one of the neat things about this is that within a geographic region, you see a huge range. You got some herds with very good lameness, so basically very little lameness, to huge amounts across that spectrum. And one of the things that they did in that study, particularly in British Columbia, they went on and measured the lying. They actually did this across all of them, but they particularly looked at the relationship between the lying behavior and that lameness on those farms in the British Columbia farms. And we're able to look at the amount of time cows are spending lying down in relation to that lameness. And that's what I have here, is these are the farms from British Columbia and Canada, the average amount of lying time across those 40 herds. And what you have here is the standard deviation, and then you have your kind of min and max cows within those herds. And so when you look at the variation in lying time, what do you notice in relation to the variation in the amount of lameness that you saw? There's not as much variation, right? So when we think about using lying time, so general overall lying time of cows within a given dairy, it's very difficult to make any kind of comparison between, say, this dairy and this dairy, even if they're spending a half an hour longer. It doesn't correlate very well with, say, the overall incidence of lameness. And that's something we've learned quite well over the years, that we can't use that number. It doesn't really tell us much, and there's going to be a variety of factors influencing that. But what's unique about this is that we can probably use these numbers, particularly these outliers, as better indicators. So within a herd, if we're tracking something like lying behavior, we can look from kind of deviations from the normal within the herd. And that's where the data set actually played out very well, where they found that high lying time, so cows that were spending more than 14.5 hours per day lying down, having long lying bouts, longer than greater than 90 minutes per lying bout, were actually at a higher odds of severe lameness. And so it's these cows that are basically spending a lot of time, they're less motivated to get up and down as often, and spending a lot of time that we can identify as potentially having lameness in these herds. And again, going back to what I said before, we've got tools out there. There's a variety of different automated measures that we can use on our farms now to do these things, and we can set up, hopefully work with the companies that sell these systems to set these systems up that we can actually identify these cows that are deviating from their own normal, but also the herd normal that they're functioning within. And the last example I want to give is standing behavior and lameness. And this is another interesting example. We often think about lameness related to the lying surface of the cow, how long the cow spends lying down, but there's some other data I wanted to share with you that actually links where a cow stands and how that relates to lameness. And so this is a study done by Dr. Katie Proudfoot. Katie was a graduate student in Canada and is now a professor in the United States at the Ohio State University. But what Katie did was she focused her PhD research on looking at the behavior of the transition dairy cow in relation to a variety of things. And one of them was standing behavior of cows. And what you have here is the average amount of time cows spent standing, so in minutes per day, at 4 different time points. So 2 weeks before calving, 24 hours after calving, 1 week and 2 weeks after calving. And what Katie did is follow a group of cows right out to mid-lactation. At mid-lactation, she looked at those cows and looked at which cows developed sole lesions and ulcers in their feet. And then, knowing which cows either had no foot problems versus those that developed foot problems, went back in her data set and teased out their standing and lying behavior. And what she found was that those cows that 3-4 months later developed foot problems were already showing higher standing times in the 2 weeks before calving and right up to the period of calving, 2 weeks or 24 hours after calving, versus those cows that stayed healthy. So there's a definite difference in how those cows were behaving around that around that time point. And what was neat about this data set is this data came from data loggers that she had on the legs of the cows, but she also, this was a research facility, she also had video cameras in the cow, and she went through and watched the videotape on these cows and could tease out exactly where the cows were standing in the pen across the day. And so she could tease out where the cows were actually spending this extra amount of time standing. So the first thing she looked at was how much time the cows were spending feeding. So between those cows that remained healthy versus developed foot lesions. So that was fairly similar. The amount of time they spent standing in the feed alley, so behind the feed rail but just waiting for access potentially, again was very similar between those groups of cows. The amount of time they spent in the other alley, it was a 3-row barn, so the back alley, again very similar. The amount of time that cows spent with all 4 feet standing in their stall was very similar. And then the only difference in the amount of spending time between those cows that developed foot problems versus those that stayed healthy was the amount of time that cows spent perching in their stalls. So with 2 feet in their free stall versus 4 feet or standing somewhere else. And again, for some of you here, you've probably heard this before. When we walk into a freestall barn and we see a lot of cows perching, we recognize it as a problem. And there have been other studies previously that have made associations between foot problems, between lameness, and the expression of perching behavior. And largely, until this data, it was really kind of cause and effect was not known. And it's still not perfectly clear whether or not cows perform the behavior and that leads to the problem, or the behavior occurs in response to foot problems, etc. But given the timeline associated with this study, it seems like there might be some more cause than effect in this case in terms of driving cows that are performing this behavior being more at risk of developing foot problems and becoming lame later on. And the nice thing about this behavior, so this is one of these ones that when we walk into a barn and we see this behavior, it's one of these behaviors that when we see it, we know there's things that we can do about it. So what can we do to prevent that cow from doing that? I heard headrail. So the position of the headrail. So there's really 2 things. We can make the stall wider and we can make it longer, or push the headrail up, right? So push the neck rail forward or push it higher. So basically giving that cow more space. And again, there's lots of good science to suggest that. So again, this could be a whole other discussion, but when we provide free stalls with enough space, when they're wide enough, we move that neck rail higher, we move it further away from the back of the curb, we see less of that perching behavior. This is an interesting one from a barn management standpoint, because what else happens when you do that? What's that? More muck in the bed. So this is a classic example of where when we make housing more comfortable, particularly in response to the behavior of cows, cows use that stall more often. It becomes basically more well used, and at the same time you're going to end up with more crap in the stalls basically, and you're going to have to maintain that stall even more. And this is often a dilemma for producers. They want housing that stays nice and clean, that they have to maintain less, but at the same time, the cows don't use. And I can probably frankly say that no such thing really exists where we have stalls and such that stay clean, but the cows use them to their optimal advantage. So if we want stalls that are very comfortable, yes, they're going to get dirty and they're going to get soiled, and you're going to have to put a little bit more effort into keeping those stalls clean. And that's just the kind of the nature of the beast, so to speak. So take-home messages. It's very important to identify cows with illness, and we can use behavior to do that. We can not only identify those cows that are at risk, but also identify cows with problems. So I say it's important to watch cows. Visual detection of changes is sometimes difficult, And obviously, the examples I've given today, we do have technologies now, and those technologies are growing. I will accept questions on those as we go along here. There's a lot of new technologies out there. A lot of them, though, I'm quite hesitant to promote because we don't have good validation of a lot of things. And I urge you, if you're going to invest a lot of money, particularly into a system that's going to automatically measure something on your farm, that you're pretty confident, you're very confident that that system is measuring exactly what you want it to measure, and it's going to do that accurately and precisely on a consistent basis. And I'd make sure that there's very good data and backup to support that going forward. And lastly, I guess, and this is, I've already talked about this, changes in behavior don't always indicate what the exact problem is. So we also have to be happy knowing that if we're going to see some kind of change in behavior and recognize that and identify that we can also then, or that basically leads us to having to do more investigation. And so what it's doing is it's probably cutting out some time frame there in terms of from the time point where we might be seeing it normally versus potentially identifying these cows a little bit earlier, taking a quicker look at them, or like I said before, identifying where problems might be creeping up, and that might be related into housing and environment or management changes that might be made that can reduce whatever behaviors that we're seeing within our herds. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Trevor. That was a tremendous presentation, and on behalf of everyone, thank you very much for making it. Are there questions for Trevor before we... Yes, please. Yes. Do we have another microphone? No. Might just...
There's a whole bunch of them.
Yeah. You've exhausted most of them. It's just...
Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation. It was brilliant. I was interested in the dip pre-calving data that you showed, where your outcome that you were looking back from was mastitis, and I think you also showed ketosis. Mm-hmm. And I think you made a reference to things like trough space and different things like that, but I wondered whether you'd looked at locomotion in those individual cows and whether that was a cofactor leading to the lack of intake. I say that based on my own experience of looking at cows in the UK.
I can say in those studies that wasn't a factor, but definitely it very well could be. I know in the study on ketosis, which I showed, we're looking at that. That's not factored into my analysis yet. That's why I say it's preliminary data. I'm not going to hang my hat on it quite yet because we're going to tease out a bunch of things. So we're going to be looking at that because that's, there could be a whole host of other things impacting those cows at that time point already, which might be causing that behavior or elucidating that behavior and thus causing that chain reaction of problems that might occur to that cow.
And were there parity differences, heifers v. multi-parous cows or anything like that? Did you pick anything? I'm looking for cow factors as much as environmental factors or management factors.
And I have to think back because I think there wasn't, but they might not even use first lactation cows in that case. So I have to think back. Yeah, sorry, foggy on it. But there could be, again, and related to, and that's why I said there's probably a lot of things pre-calving that's going on, the management of those cows during the dry period. And that's when we look at those, the ability of cows to maximize their intake at that period, we got to kind of look broadly, right? Where have they come from previous to that close-up period? What are they experiencing during that close-up period? Are they first lactation cows that are thrown in for the first time with older boss cows, whatever it might be, right? That might be limiting their ability to get to feed. And then you have to think about how you're going to get them to access that feed at that time point as well.
Thank you. Just a question there. Thanks, Mike. Just in front of you there. Is it? Yeah.
Well, maybe I can add something because we focus a lot on rumen fill the last days before calving. And when you look at rumen fill the last days before calving, lameness is risk factor number 1.
I appreciate your contribution. Actually, I wouldn't mind you just saying, because I know you, but I mean, maybe you could just give your background to saying that. That would be really helpful, please.
My name is Lucas Telsma. I'm from the Netherlands. I worked for 20 years at a practical training center. Did a lot in hoof trimming over there, and the last 11 years I worked for the agri-firm company a feed company in Holland, and I do a lot of training to my colleagues, and my specialism is hoof problems, hoof care.
Thank you, Lucas. Appreciate it.
Is there a correlation between the perching behavior and the size of the cow?
There could be. I've never seen it myself in a study looking at it per se. I should be careful, actually. I do have some data myself. We looked at, we've got some farms in our area that have built very large stalls. And obviously in a large stall, then what I was saying before, you get these cows walking in, standing 4 feet. So a number of producers have added a kind of a secondary head rail, neck rail, a mobile one made out of plastic, just that the bigger cows can push against it, the smaller cows can push back on, or that maybe the small cows won't, but use a visual deterrent to stay a little bit back in the stall. And in that case, we did measure cows. We looked at that, and we really didn't see any difference in terms of between the bigger and smaller cows in terms of the stall usage, how and when how much time they're spending with, say, all 4 feet in or 2 feet in the stalls. Because what was happening in that case is basically when anything we introduced this secondary head rail, basically pushed all the cows out. Even the bigger cows didn't want to push against it, even though it was fairly light and they could push against it. They didn't want to spend as much. So we saw a bit more perching across all the cows in that scenario. So.
Thank you. Question here?
Trevor, 2 questions. Since many of the signs, behavioral signs that you have, are very non-specific as to what is causing them to act one way or another, and since those technologies and automation systems are not yet very accurate in detecting, they're still developing algorithms as to give us the cause and effect reason. When do you think technologies will be able to give us a more precise reading or interpretation of whatever is causing the herd to act abnormally? That's first question. And second question is, when you look at feeding patterns and some other patterns of behavior in a pen or a herd, have you done or have you read any trials where they actually trying to find if there is a specific cow that's more bullying than others, some kind of in the hierarchy of cows that maybe there is some more aggressive cow or that is changing the overall pattern
of the whole
maybe
group.
That's distorting the whole picture of the behavior.
Okay. Well, so for the first question, which was, do you think and when do you think we'll get to a point where we can use some of these technologies to actually pinpoint what might be wrong with a cow using different algorithms, etc.? Because of, especially some of the examples I showed you, because a lot of these things are non-specific, I don't know if we'll ever get there at all. And one of the reasons for that, if all our dairy farms were designed exactly the same way, as our cows were built exactly the same way, they all had the same genetics, right, same rations, everything, maybe we could get to them. But every time you introduce some little variation in management, and you saw that with the herds with, say, lying time across, right? So yeah, there's not a huge amount of variation herd to herd, but there's huge variation within a herd in terms of lying time, right? And so there's going to be a whole host of factors that contribute to that within that given herd. And so every herd's going to be different. So yeah, company X designs an algorithm for detecting a certain change in rumination and says that's related to acidosis. Potentially, yes, but you go to the next herd over and their whole distribution of rumination time is going to be drastically different. It's going to be related to the feeding program on that farm, when they're fed, how often, all those kind of things. So it becomes very difficult to control for all those extraneous factors which might influence it. So it's a difficult question. Yeah, I don't have a good answer there. Sorry. The other question was about looking at whether or not, are you saying like a single animal within a pen could influence kind of the behavior?
I'm just thinking that in some groups there might be a cow or 2 cows that are more bossy than others that are more quiet and calm, and then you can attribute a certain behavioral pattern to some environmental issue rather than just behavior of individual cows.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, and we've done some of that work, particularly looking at stocking densities, bunk spaces, right? stall stocking density. Looking at the behavior of certain cows within the pen, trying to tease out the subordinate and dominant cows, and then how that changes, right? Something like feed space allowance, right? You give them more space, and you tend not to see a change in the behavior of the dominant cows, but it's the behavior. They're still going to try displace as many people, but it's those subordinate cows which tend to get displaced less because they're able to avoid, say, the dominant cows within the group, right? So it does change, right, the overall kind of group dynamic. I don't know if that's what you're kind of getting at.
I was practically thinking maybe if you can identify a really bossy cow and you remove it from a pen, maybe you'll improve the whole.
Yeah, that's
pattern.
an interesting concept, but one of the things that's interesting, particularly with freestall house cows, and we have some data that suggests that, say, a bossy cow, and you're always going to find there might be one bossy cow in a group who is dominant on kind of every level. But when we look across groups of cows and we look at dominance patterns, we actually find that dairy cows, their level of dominance depends often on the specific resource that they're accessing. So one cow who's dominant at the feed bunk necessarily might not be dominant at the stalls or at the water trough or even the rotating brush, which we found in a study. And so some cows will place higher priority basically on accessing certain resources. So the dominant structure is not always that clear. And what you also see is when you remove a cow, a bossy cow, you see someone else pop up. So there's not necessarily, yeah.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed, Trevor. I appreciate that. And thank you for the questions. Is there another last question before I just, please, Kenneth, just here at the front.
Thanks, Trevor. I just want to get your opinion. A lot of big dairies around the world are feeding their pre-fresh cows only once a day. And they strongly believe if they do that in the late afternoon or early evening, that they calve more in the morning. But what do we do on intakes if we only feed those cows once a day? And how do that respond to the data that you are showing us?
So, okay, so your pre-fresh cows, feeding them once a day, late in the day. I guess I'll try extrapolate. I don't have good data on those, but we know when we feed our lactating cows, particularly if you're in my session earlier, and one of the things I advocate is multiple days or multiple feedings per day, and for a variety of reasons. But one of the things when you move, particularly feeding to late in the day, what you actually see, and particularly in warm temperatures in summertime, is you see cows gorging on that feed during that nighttime period, where there's some studies in Canada where they're feeding cows at 9 o'clock at night, their total daily allotment, and they'd consume about 30 to 40% of their dry matter within a couple hours after feed delivery. And that's because that feed is going to have a much longer period of time, specifically in kind of the last 6 to 7 hours before they get new feed again the next day to heat up in the afternoon. So they're not going to want to feed much. So my fear is that you create a very quote-unquote unhealthy eating pattern in the cow, where they're having a very kind of large meal that time period, and later on in the day they might be hungry, and they're kind of building up hunger, and they might have, the rumen's not going to be empty obviously, but you might have a bit of a dip there, and then they gorge again later at night. And if that pattern carries over, right, into lactation, that's not a good pattern to develop either. So it'd be something I would probably not advocate myself, just based on that, but I haven't seen, again, any work on pre-fresh cows specifically in relation to that.
Thank you very much indeed. And actually there's a workshop on bunk management that you're doing tomorrow, I think, Trevor. So anyone that, I almost say that it's probably already sold out, but I mean, if you can get into that workshop, I'd encourage you to be there, or at least by the door to squeeze in if that was possible, but I better not say that. Okay. No, thank you very much indeed, Trevor. I really do appreciate it. And it's been, what an afternoon. Mike Van Amberg, Tom, and Trevor as well. Tremendous afternoon here. Can I thank you as well for your questions, your interaction, and also maybe the fact that this is the first session you've been in, given the other sessions that are there available to you this afternoon.